Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Selling Greenville, your favorite real estate podcast here in Greenville, South Carolina. I'm your host as always, Stan McCune, realtor right here in the Greenville area. You can find all of my contact information in the show notes if you need to reach out to me for any of your real estate needs. Just a reminder as always, please subscribe to the show, whatever you're watching or listening to it on, whatever platform. Subscribe, hit the 5-star rating, leave a little review, like, comment, whatever your platform allows you to do, please do that. That is pretty much all I ask for you guys to do to support the show, get it out to as many people as possible, and I would really appreciate you guys doing it. I have received a lot of messages the past few days about the death of the 6% commission, which is the headlines all over the news right now ever since this past week when a settlement by the National Association of REALTORS, also known as NAR, was announced. And so you may or may not have heard about this, but regardless, the audience has told me that this is what they want to talk about. Now, we do have the Greater Greenville Association of Realtors market stats was just released yesterday. We're going to have to kick that can another week here because people want to talk about realtor commissions. This is the first time people have ever wanted to talk about this. But again, it's all over the media. You may or may not have heard about it. Like I said, news publications are calling it the death of the 6% commission, which is a wild interpretation, in my opinion, of a settlement that the National Association of Realtors announced on Friday, March the 15th. I considered releasing this podcast as a breaking news early edition, but after thinking about it, I decided to let it marinate in my mind, give me some time to read other opinions, listen to other opinions on what happened, talk to some other agents, kind of see what people are thinking, what sentiment is out there. And it's probably a good thing, to be honest, that I let this marinate in my mind for a few days because I'm recording this on March 19th. I'm going to release this tomorrow, the 20th. But I have a bunch of notes written out here, and in my initial notes, I called out some people and probably would have said some things that would have gotten me in trouble. So I have reduced my notes to only things that hopefully will not get me in trouble. Some of you probably wanted me to name names on here, but I would like to keep my job and not get myself in trouble. So I calmed down, I refined my content, and decided to stick with my normal schedule of releasing this podcast every Wednesday. So here we are. And I feel like in order for us to really talk about what's happening with commissions, we really need to discuss some background information to lay the stage for people who might not listen to this show each week. Now, several months ago, I talked on the show about the lawsuits surrounding realtor commissions. And there are several of them, but the NAR lost a big one called Sitzer Burnett. This lawsuit that they lost stated that brokers had committed antitrust and the NAR had committed antitrust violations, essentially conspiring to keep realtor commissions at 6%, with home sellers being on the losing end of that implied arrangement. Now, I discussed on the show at the time how ridiculous that was, in my opinion. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I don't work for the Department of Justice or any of that. But to me, it was ridiculous. Not only are average commissions already less than 6%, right? If you look at averages, they're already hovering closer to 5%, but brokerages are not generally friendly with each other and simply don't sit around price fixing things, okay? I discussed that on that show, but I wanted to recap that. So to me, it was an outrageous argument that the plaintiffs made in the Sitzer Burnett case, but the NAR's defense failed. And after just a couple of hours, a jury ruled in favor of the plaintiffs that commissions had been price fixed and that sellers should not have to, in their minds, subsidize buyer agents. Okay, now this brings us to Friday, March the 15th, when we got a bombshell announcement. I don't know anyone that was prepared for this announcement, including people in leadership here in Greenville, perhaps people in leadership in the state of South Carolina. And by the way, I should mention, I'm going to give some thoughts and opinions on this show that are specific to Greenville and specific to South Carolina. If you're listening in from another state, what I'm saying may not apply to you. I just want to make that clear. But we got this bombshell announcement on Friday from the NAR. They agreed to a settlement that still has to be approved, okay? So it has to be approved by the court. So we don't know exactly if it's going to remain in its current form, or if it's going to hit the mid-July deadline that they said would be happening. We'll get to that in a second. But it still has to be approved. And so I'm about to get into the details of the settlement, but I have to cover my you-know-what in this podcast. So before I get into the high points of the settlement, I just want to make a few things very clear. Anything I say here on this show, both on this episode and all episodes on this show, if you're listening to the 200 plus episodes I've recorded, this is true for all of them. Anything I'll say on here is my opinion and not reflective of the opinions of the Morgan Group, Berkshire Hathaway Home Services of America, Sedan Joiner Realtors, or any realtor association, including the National Association of REALTORS, the South Carolina Association of REALTORS, the Greater Greenville Association of REALTORS, the Realtor Political Action Committee, or other groups that I may or may not be affiliated with. All right, that was fun, wasn't it? I feel like one of those people reading a sports gambling ad, and then they have to read like 2,000 disclosures at the end and tell people to get counseling if they have an addiction. I'm not doing that, but I do kind of feel like sometimes I have to do that to protect myself. Okay. Let's get back to the core of what we're talking about here. There is much that we don't know about how this is going to play out before I get into the details. Nothing I say on here is gospel truth, okay? And there could be changes to this settlement in the upcoming months, as I already said. Additionally, as I'm not a lawyer, nothing in this episode or on my show at all constitutes legal advice. If you need legal counsel, call an attorney. If you're an agent, consider talking to your broker if you have questions. Heck, this is a legal case, and there's a good chance I mess up some of the legal details since I'm not a lawyer. So just know that I'm not a professional legal analyst, and I'm not giving any legal advice here, okay? If we all know that, then this will go very smoothly. And by the way, attorneys are the ones making all the money from these lawsuits anyway, so they will be more than happy to talk to you if you need clarification from them. So now, that's all out there. Here are the high points of the settlement. I'm just going to read you exactly the summary from the NAR, what they sent out. So here's a summary of 3 of the points that they sent out. Settlement payment. NAR will pay $418 million over approximately 4 years. Okay, so NAR is going to pay $418 million over 4 years. A lot of money. People think that the National Association of Realtors has tons of money. No. That's a lot of money for the NAR. They don't have as much money as people think. Point number 2, written agreements for MLS participants acting for buyers. While NAR has been advocating for the use of written agreements for years, in this settlement, we have agreed to require MLS participants working with buyers to enter into written representation agreements with their buyers. This change will go into effect in mid-July 2024. Now, this part of the settlement is not what the news media latched onto, but I actually think that this is way more significant than people realize, and I'll explain that in a bit, but it could really change some things in a big way. Third point, and third and final point, compensation offers moved off MLS. NAR has agreed to put in place a new rule prohibiting offers of compensation on the multiple listing service. Offers of compensation could continue to be an option consumers can pursue off MLS through negotiation and consultation with real estate professionals. And sellers can offer buyer concession on an MLS. For example, concessions for buyer closing costs. This change will go into effect in mid-July 2024. Okay, so I'm going to be doing a lot of talking. So, excuse me as I clear my throat there. We're going to start with some basics. We've gone over this before, but for those who don't know how commissions have worked, or for those who haven't listened to the show very much, we need to, again, give a little background information. This will be a repeat for some, but it will be new for others, and so we really need to start here. And by the way, I'm just going to be honest, this is kind of an oral history, as I don't have time to chase down all the exact dates and specific lawsuits and case law and all of that. But this will get you the big picture information that you need to know in order to understand the context of realtor commissions and how we got to where we are today. All right, here we go. Residential real estate has evolved greatly in the past 100 years, okay? You guys know that, obviously. Real estate started in Wall Street, obviously has ballooned well beyond that, but it's changed a lot. And for decades, only sellers were represented. Buyers approached listing brokerages who had homes for sale that they wanted, and those brokerages helped facilitate the sale, albeit only representing the seller. Commercial real estate, by the way, operates kind of in a similar way today. Not exactly the same, but in a similar way. However, a few decades ago in residential real estate, it became apparent that real estate transactions were much more complex than they had been, right? I've spoken to agents who have been in the business for 30, 40 years, and they've told me crazy stories about how their first contract was a handshake agreement, no inspections, no financing, etc. It was just a simpler time. Things have gotten much, much more complex. Contracts that went from handwritten agreements on the back of envelopes morphed into lengthy documents with legalese to prevent criminal and unethical real estate practices. Sellers started to be obligated to disclose material facts, and not doing so meant potential lawsuits. Inspections became all important because buyers couldn't trust that sellers had disclosed everything properly. Financing real estate versus buying cash became the norm, whereas it wasn't in the past. And with that, financing and appraisal complications came. And a big one, of course, listing brokerages only representing sellers would discriminate against buyers on the basis of sex, race, gender identity, etc., etc. Buyers needed help, is where I'm going with this. And as the oral history goes, buyers started hiring agents to assist them, but it didn't make sense for the sellers to pay the full commission, typically 6 to 7%, to the listing agent when a different agent brought the buyer, right? That doesn't make sense. Even as I'm talking through it, it's like, yeah, one agent brought the buyer, that agent should get paid at least half the commission. And so after a period of figuring out where buyer agents would fit in, it became the norm for listing brokers to cooperate with buyer brokers on a real estate transaction and to split the commissions between them. And so, in other words, the listing agent has their 6, 7%, whatever, 5%, whatever commission, and it became the norm for them to essentially split that commission with a buyer agent who brought the buyer for the listing. And so that system has remained in place for decades until potentially this year. The system that the seller pays the listing agent, and the listing agent then shares a portion of their commission with the buyer's agent if there is one. Now, if there isn't a buyer's agent, then of course the entire commission just goes to the listing agent, just like the old days. Well, a person once said that time is a flat circle, and we may be dialing back the clock almost entirely to the time when the earth was still cooling and buyer agents were a novelty. If this settlement holds, listing brokerages will no longer be allowed to publicly advertise that they are compensating buyer agents. It doesn't mean that they can't compensate them, it's just that they can't publicly advertise it. Sellers, on the other hand, will be allowed to advertise that they are offering a closing cost credit or something similar to pay for a buyer agent. But for the time being, this appears like it will only be allowed to be entered into the private notes of a listing, the notes that only an agent can look at. We'll have to see. There's going to be a lot of training and a lot of figuring this out in the upcoming months. But for the moment, it looks like that some of that stuff is going to have to be in the private notes, but that may change. If seller doesn't offer to compensate a buyer agent in one way or another, then the only way for a buyer agent to get paid by someone other than the buyers themselves is to negotiate their commission with the listing brokerage and or seller directly before an offer is even made, or perhaps at the time an offer is made. Otherwise, paying the buyer agent will fall squarely on the shoulders of the buyers themselves. Now, here's something really important to understand. The multiple listing service didn't always exist, right? We're dialing back the clock even further. And as I understand, prior to it existing, different brokerages, so for instance, like a local Keller Williams office and a local Berkshire Hathaway Home Services office, they would have written agreements between each other that stated that they would compensate each other a certain amount if they worked together. I'm hearing rumors that could be the way compensation agreements are in fact moved off MLS, that they just become broker-to-broker agreements. And again, as I said earlier, we're basically dialing back the clock, potentially back decades. But I do wonder if we have a system with broker-to-broker agreements, does this run into more antitrust issues? I mean, the genesis of all of these lawsuits that we have right now over realtor commissions is the myth that brokers conspired to price fix commissions. So if brokerages actually agreed on compensation together, I don't know. I don't know how the Department of Justice would look at that. But these are questions for the attorneys who are making all the money right now in this situation, and it's way above my pay grade. But I do think we're going to see the industry find creative solutions to this problem that perhaps aren't obvious right now. It only appears right now that there might be some cryptic things in the what we call the member remarks, which are the hidden notes in MLS. But I suspect that won't be the case when it's all said and done. But let's go back to the settlement for a second. The question has to be asked, why did NAR do this? They had originally said that they were appealing the original Sitzer Burnett lawsuit and that the appeal could take years. That was what we've been told for several months now. Now, what I understand, and you can look this up and see this true, 2 of the largest brokerages in the U.S. have already settled from this lawsuit. And what I understand is that those settlements in particular left the NAR as a lame duck in terms of appealing this case. NAR's legal counsel determined that an appeal to the case would simply bleed more money to attorneys without likely helping the realtors the NAR is supposed to help. And so a settlement was really the only path forward. The NAR also stated that appealing would have only, in the best case, addressed this one lawsuit, and there are a bunch of copycat lawsuits that the appeal wouldn't have impacted. So basically, once Sitzer Burnett was lost, settlement was really the only path forward. So here we are. If you're wondering why they settled, that is my understanding. Additionally, I just want to address, I've heard a ton of agents talking about leaving the NAR in light of this development. And if you're an agent listening to this, I just want to ask you, where are you going to go? I imagine a company like CoStar, perhaps, which operates in the commercial real estate world, will likely see an opportunity here to undermine NAR and the multiple listing services throughout the country. They and others will likely pounce to try to create competition for the NAR. And competition is usually a good thing, but with the Sitzer Burnett case, precedent has been set, and the Department of Justice is 100% behind this. They've been saying for years that they have real estate commissions in their crosshairs, like I said, for years now. And so I really don't see a path forward where this is going to be changed if people leave the NAR. The precedent has been set. This was about commissions. This wasn't about NAR. And so if you're a real estate professional making commissions in the residential real estate world, this, I believe, is going to impact you regardless of who you're affiliated with. Now, again, that's not legal advice. That's just what seems to make sense to me. Now, I also can't emphasize enough that the jury for Sitzer Burnett only deliberated for a few hours. It wasn't even a hard decision in their mind. And no surprise there, because they essentially blocked anyone with real estate connections from serving on the jury, which I understand to a certain extent. But man, that's tough. A huge portion of the country, millions of people are realtors. So to completely cut them and any connections to them out of the jury, how were we going to get a fair lawsuit? How were we going to get a fair trial with that happening? I just don't think it was possible. So guess what happens in an environment where housing affordability is at an all-time low and people are looking for someone to blame for housing affordability? Well, someone gets blamed. And the easy target was the National Association of REALTORS and big real estate brokerages who most people think make a lot more money than they do. So like it or not, it appears from my perspective that no case the NAR made was really going to work with this jury. And even if you're unhappy with the NAR over what happened, and I'm certainly not happy that they lost the case, but leaving the NAR doesn't fix the problem, because it was really, as I already said, commissions that were in the crosshairs of the prosecutors and the DOJ, more so than the defendants in the lawsuit. But there's a lot more to unpack here. So let me start by saying the settlement isn't inherently good or bad. Okay, I could see outcomes where it could be good for the industry in the long run. I could also see outcomes where it isn't. In the short term, however, I do think that there are some clear winners and losers, at least based on the information that we have today. For experienced agents, for instance, I definitely think that this could be a good thing. Likely a large portion of inexperienced agents who can't articulate their value will be dropping out in the next few years as a direct result of this. And the experienced agents, like Cream, will rise to the top as a result. And yes, I do consider myself an experienced agent. And I do think that I serve to benefit from this if I handle it right with my clients. It also could be a win for experienced home buyers and sellers like investors, mega corporations, etc. In fact, immediately after the settlement was announced, several mega corporations in real estate chimed in that they were very excited about this settlement. Anyone surprised that the Department of Justice is behind something that clearly benefits corporations and could potentially hurt small businesses, self-employed people, and entrepreneurs? I'm not surprised. If you've been following the Department of Justice at all, you know that it's not exactly without its issues in that branch of government or in that wing of government. Remember, the brokerages who were sued only make as much money as their agents bring them. This is what I'm alluding to when I say that they don't make as much money as people think. They don't make any money except for the money that their agents bring to them, right? And most of those agents across the country are self-employed realtors, so they're not even employees of these companies. And so brokerages are just companies that house predominantly self-employed realtors. And so, again, at the end of the day, this is, even though the lawsuit was about brokerages, it's agents like myself that make up the brokerages and agents like myself that pay those brokerages. And so the idea that these big bad brokerages needed to be penalized is, in my opinion, ridiculous. But I digress. This is obviously going to be bad for some people. I just mentioned some that it might be good for. It is obviously going to be bad for some people. So let's start with the obvious. The NAR, the National Association of Realtors, sorry, I had a Joe Biden moment there, indirectly oversees state and local realtor associations throughout the country, okay? In Greenville, we have the Greater Greenville Association, which is a part of the South Carolina Association, which is a part of the National Association of Realtors. And these state and local associations, like the ones I just mentioned, they answer to NAR. And those local associations, despite being predominantly nonprofit trade associations, usually own local multiple listing services, which are for-profit businesses, okay? Not going to get too in the weeds on that. Just know that's the way it's structured, generally speaking. There are some exceptions. And that is an odd structure, I will admit it. It's an odd structure, but it's the one we've had for decades now. This is not a new structure. We've had it for decades. And long story short, where I'm going with this is that the NAR membership is likely to suffer as a result of this. And with that, local associations and local MLSs. Now, can we be confident that the NAR and these state and local associations will survive? I think that the NAR and state associations will, but I suspect that a lot of small associations could end up folding entirely or just folding into some of the larger associations. So for instance, in the upstate, we have the Greater Greenville Association, we have the Spartanburg Association, we have Western Upstate, we have Greenwood, and we have others. Now, I don't know how financially solvent all of these are besides Greenville, which I believe Greenville will be fine. But might some of these smaller associations merge now or just shut down altogether? Time will tell. I don't know. Like I said, I don't know how financially solvent they are. But if they see huge membership drops or are unable to reach settlements themselves because the NAR had to leave the door open for additional settlements, then they may have no choice. And a recent study came out showing that 49% of realtors have 1 or 0 closings per year. You have to think that a huge portion of those agents will be dropping out in the next few years, and that will have a ripple effect on various local associations. Also obvious is that this is bad for a lot of buyers, particularly inexperienced buyers who really rely on their agents and maybe can't afford to pay one. When this goes into place, buyers are going to have to assume that they will be paying their buyer agent commission in full at closing. What does that mean? Well, it means a lot, and not just for buyers, okay? Well, we'll start with buyers. Probably a lot of buyers will choose to wing it without an agent. I don't think the majority will, but I suspect more so than what we've seen in the past. They'll decide to wing it without an agent, you know? Don't want to have to commit to paying one, don't want to have to commit to working with one. And this will, again, dial back the clock to what it was like decades ago. This is going to be a massive issue for buyers who don't know what they're doing in a real estate transaction. And sellers will also have to really think twice about whether they truly want to offer 0% a 0% commission to buyer agents, basically not offering any commission to buyer agents. Trust me when I say this, a good buyer agent provides a ton of value and really helps to shield both the listing agent and the seller from a lot of hassle they would otherwise have to deal with if they were negotiating directly with the buyer. Buyers agents don't just benefit their buyer clients, they benefit the entire transaction, including the sellers. Don't forget as well that fair housing laws are in place to protect predominantly buyers. When a listing agent and a seller are dealing with the buyer directly, they are much more likely to discriminate against that buyer. And I can tell you, I have had multiple times in my career when sellers have asked me to commit, usually innocently, but they've asked me to commit a fair housing violation, wanting to know, marital status, different things about the people potentially buying their house. A lot of sellers have emotional investment into a house that they're selling, and they want to know that the people buying their home are going to treat it well, and they might want those buyers to have a certain religious affiliation, different things like that. Those are fair housing violations. And guess what? If the buyer is going directly to the seller or listing agent, it is much more likely for that to happen. If I'm representing a buyer or a seller, I don't let it happen. If there's a potential fair housing violation that I'm being asked to participate in, I simply say, I'm sorry, that's not a question that I can answer. If you if you want to do some research and look into this yourself, feel free to, but I have agreed to not give that type of commentary in a real estate transaction. But this is likely to start increasing tremendously if you have a lot more buyers that are unrepresented. But let's go back to the sellers for a minute. I don't think we can overstate how bad this could turn out if a bunch of buyers start being unrepresented. Sellers have benefited for decades now with buyer agents bringing their experience to bear on their buyer clients. Now, I hear complaints all the time about inexperienced buyer agents making a transaction difficult. Imagine how much worse that will be if an unrepresented buyer who doesn't know what they're doing freaks out at inspection reports, gets confused by contract language, etc. If there's a ton more of these types of buyers in the market without an agent guiding them, the fallout would really be tremendous. Now, some of you know that I flip houses on the side. Not a big thing that I do in comparison to my business as a realtor, but it's something I do on the side. And so I usually have several listings per year where I am the listing agent and the seller. Now, I still intend, even after this goes into place in July or whenever it goes into place, I still intend to compensate buyer agents because I genuinely see the value, and I don't want to limit myself to only buyers who can afford their agents. So I'm not just saying this to try to prop up the real estate industry. You think this little podcast is going to prop up the real estate industry anyway? No, I genuinely believe it to the point where I directly, myself, compensate buyer agents already tens of thousands of dollars per year when they bring a buyer for my flip properties. So I'm speaking from conviction, not just saying what I want to say because my career could be impacted by these decisions. Additionally, without question, sellers are going to ask listing agents to price their homes the same way, regardless of whether they are offering a buyer agent commission or not. And that is not how this is going to work. If you're looking to sell your home but don't want to pay a buyer agent commission, you should assume that you won't get the same price for your home as you would if you were offering to pay a buyer agent. Why? Well, you're not going to be availing yourself of all the buyers who can't afford to pay their agent, which is a lot of buyers right now. And or you're going to get people making offers but still asking for you to pay their agent's commission. And if you just won't do that under any circumstances, then we'll have to do a much closer look at the comps prior to setting your listing price to see what buyer agents were paid in the comps and how that may have impacted the sale. It's not as simple as just, okay, I can now save commissions and still get full price for my house. Those commissions are a part of the full price that you're seeing when you're looking at comps. So you have to think about things a little bit differently than just having that scarcity mindset of trying to chisel away as many commissions as possible. But now let's go back to buyers for a moment. Specifically, vets who are trying to purchase a home with a VA loan. The VA loan program is really a great program. I'm VA certified. I love the program, but it doesn't allow for buyers to pay for their buyer agent commissions. So vets literally can't agree to compensate a buyer agent. And so depending on how some of these things resolve themselves, a buyer agent taking on a client who is getting a VA loan may find themselves in a spot where they have to assume they are working for that buyer client for free. Again, that is not good for VA buyers, and not good for buyer agents who represent a lot of vets. Now, we do have a compensation agreement in the state of South Carolina that allows for sellers to agree to compensate a buyer agent directly, i.e. without it having to be in the form of a closing cost concession, which would be illegal for the VA. I believe that this compensation agreement probably would be a suitable workaround. I'm not a broker and I'm not an attorney, but just based on what I know about the VA, I think that compensation agreement would work for the VA because it would be a separate agreement tied to a VA buyer contract, but not involving the VA buyer having to compensate their agent. But this is still a very clunky system, having to do the compensation agreement, and it leaves agents representing VA buyers in a really tricky spot, not to mention the VA buyers themselves, who ultimately get hurt the most by all of this. So time will tell whether the VA updates their guidelines and or whether a system emerges that allows for workarounds so that VA's purchasers don't end up kind of on an island, really taking the brunt of the settlement. Needless to say, I told you I was going to be doing a lot of talking. I've got a lot more content here to come. We are not done yet. Needless to say, we can very easily see a system coming about organically where buyers have two implied tiers of agents to choose from. Perhaps experienced agents who set the prices that their buyers have to pay them if a seller or listing brokerage won't, and perhaps a second tier of inexperienced agents who are willing to take anything that they can get in terms of commissions. We already have something similar with listings, where there are some flat fee listing services that only list a home on MLS and then the seller has to do the rest of the work. Well, guess what happens with those listings? Some do them well. I'm not saying that every flat fee service does a poor job, but the reality is many of them take crooked photos, do bad listing descriptions, etc. I mean, these are listing agents that have to do tremendous volume, right? They're only getting a few $100s per listing, maybe $1,000, maybe $1,500. And so you can't make a whole lot of money just getting $1,000 a pop, right? And so it can be difficult for them to allocate enough time to each listing that they have. Although obviously, again, there are good ones out there. I'm not saying that they're all bad. Good ones find a way. But oftentimes, if you're looking online, you're seeing a listing that just has awful photos, no listing description, etc., etc. I can almost guarantee you it is a flat fee listing service, that second tier of listings. Is something similar about to happen with low-cost buyer agents? Very possible. Are we moving towards a structure where some buyer agents don't offer a one-stop shop, as I do, but are simply opening doors for, maybe $100 a pop every listing or every showing you want to do? Have to pay $100. Every offer that I write, you have to pay $500, etc. Again, I don't know. It's too early to say, but these outcomes are very much in the cards. And not all of these are bad things. Some people would potentially really benefit from just having an agent that isn't a one-stop shop, that they're just kind of paying a la carte. And having multiple tiers of service could actually be a benefit to the industry as a whole, as long as it doesn't result in a lot more inexperienced agents messing up transactions because they don't have the time to put into it, since they're only making a few $100s from it. And this brings me back to the part of this settlement that to me is maybe the most interesting part, okay? The settlement states that a buyer receiving a tour from a realtor must have a written agreement in place specifying the compensation the buyer may have to pay the buyer agent as a result of working with them. This may come as a surprise to some of you, okay? But many people asking for realtors to show them homes do so before they have signed a realtor representation agreement. If I have a listing, for instance, I'll get calls from people without agents wanting me to give them a tour of the home. In fact, I just got one of those today. Just a couple of hours before I started recording this, someone called me about one of my listings. They want to go tour the home tomorrow. We set that up, and I'm going to be doing that. Well, it appears starting in July that will no longer be allowed unless they sign an actual agreement for me to represent them as their buyer agent and that they're agreeing to compensate me for that service. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be a marriage between the two parties. There are creative ways to get around this, right? You could do, for instance, a one-day representation agreement. But it appears that the days are coming to an end where people can have realtors show them home without having any agreement with them in writing. Those days are coming to an end. It's going to be that if you're looking at homes with an agent, it is your agent. It is not simply a person who you don't have a commitment to. And that's going to be interesting. It's going to be really fun to police. And of course, the lawsuits that follow from this settlement and from all of these different, this new Wild West that we're entering into, the lawsuits are going to feed attorney families for decades to come. I can promise you that. Think about this. Okay, I've thought through a lot of different scenarios. What happens if I meet with a potential buyer client and tell them that my fee as a buyer agent is 3%, and they say they can't afford that, and I tell them that I can't help them because that's what I charge to everyone? What if that person happens to also be part of a protected class of people that I'm not allowed to discriminate against and that I don't want to discriminate against, okay? But did I just inadvertently discriminate against them by telling them I can't work for them because they can't afford me, even though it had nothing to do with their protected status? Well, you say, well, maybe brokerages could just step in and say that all of their agents must charge a 3% commission to their buyer clients. Well, okay, that would certainly simplify some things, but wouldn't that take us back to the whole price fixing antitrust issue? I don't know. Honestly, I think the Department of Justice knows that this is going to open up a whole can of legal worms, and they want that. They want the chaos because, like I said, it's going to feed families for years in the legal space. And of course, there will be buyers who lie and say that they can afford to pay their agent, and then when it comes to closing, they're going to say, hey, I don't have the money to pay you. I'm sorry. I need to get this house. We found a bunch of repairs that need to be done. I need to do those repairs out of this money that I was going to pay you out of for your commission. I'm sorry. I just can't pay you anymore. But they're going to expect for the agent to not hold up the real estate transaction, right? They're going to put you on a guilt trip. They're going to say, hey, I'm a first-time home buyer. I can't help it. I need this home. We're a young family. We have to buy this home. It's going to be really awkward when these types of things happen. And I'm wondering if we're entering into an era where a buyer will have to provide proof of funds just to work with a buyer agent. It's a worthwhile consideration. But again, that might even be an ethical violation on some level. We don't know yet. There's going to be a lot of training coming down from brokerages and from the National Association of REALTORS to figure all these things out. But needless to say, the second half of this year is going to be a bit of the Wild West. Now, while we're talking about the ethical piece of this puzzle, it has been mentioned how eliminating cooperative compensation from the MLS has great potential to increase steering, which is an illegal practice of realtors directing buyer clients away from certain listings that might fit the buyer's criteria, but that the buyer's agent doesn't want for them to buy for one reason or another. A few years ago, MLSs took away realtors' ability to filter homes based on commissions being offered in order to specifically prevent steering. Well, guess what's about to happen a lot more often? You probably guessed it. 2 homes are listed in the same area. Very similar homes. One is offering the seller to pay closing costs to cover buyer agent commissions, and the other doesn't. And the realtor is working for and the buyer agent that is looking at these 2 homes potentially on behalf of their buyer client is working for a cash-strapped buyer with a buyer agency agreement that states that the buyer doesn't have to pay the buyer agent anything. The buyer agent is essentially working for free unless the seller pays them something. The buyer agent is obviously going to be tempted to steer the client towards a home where they know they will be getting paid versus a home where they won't be getting paid. Usually cash-strapped buyers, by the way, are the ones that require the most work, often looking at dozens of homes and putting in multiple offers before they finally get one under contract. Imagine doing 40 hours worth of work for a client, and I frequently do 40 plus hours of work for clients, only to not get paid for it. That's the reality that agents could be facing with some of their clients in the future. Another possibility that I could totally see happening is that businesses in the real estate world who aren't affiliated with the National Association of Realtors could see an opportunity to capture new business giving guidance to unrepresented buyers. For instance, lenders who right now are the slowest they've been in a decade and a half and desperately need more closings could see a play here. If someone comes to them before going to a realtor and they don't have a lot of money and are likely unable to afford to pay for a buyer agent, will the lender discourage them from being represented and try to assist them indirectly? Perhaps lenders will start to advertise that they even offer some sort of agent services. Perhaps they will even take agents onto their payroll who are on salary and don't get a commission at all, or maybe a very small commission, but have to help buyers working with that lender get to a closing. What about closing attorneys? Which South Carolina is an attorney state. We have closing attorneys. They're in a really logical spot to potentially start offering transaction services themselves, besides merely the title services they currently offer. These scenarios, I admit, there would be some legal hurdles here, but don't be surprised if some of these things happen in one form or another. Now, the one saving grace we have here in all of this is that South Carolina has had for years now a buyer agency agreement that specifies the buyer agent will try to get the listing agent slash seller to pay for the buyer commission. But if they don't, if the listing brokerage or the seller is not paying the buyer commission outlined in the buyer agency agreement, then it is the buyer's responsibility. Now, this document, the buyer agency agreement, for years was just a formality. But in more recent years, it's really become more important as commissions have been eroding away, particularly with certain budget developers who will not be named, but who feel they can throw their weight around and sell homes with or without a buyer agent. So they're basically just throwing a few $100 at a buyer agent and just telling them, that's all you're going to make. Believe it or not, 2/3 of the country up to this point haven't been using a contract between buyers and their agents. And that is insane to me. And I'm glad South Carolina was ahead of the curve. We can thank the South Carolina Association of Realtors for doing that. Needless to say, the buyer agency contract is going to be more important than ever. And I don't think that there's a big risk of steering for buyers who have agreed upfront to compensate their agents. But as I said before, the agents working for free or at a dramatically reduced price are going to be very tempted to steer. That is, I'm just being honest. And in the end, the reality is that agents are going to have to talk about their compensation with their clients more than ever. And that's probably not going to be a comfortable conversation for many. I mean, it's not a comfortable conversation for me. I'll be completely honest. I hate that part, but it has to happen. Already, there's a perception that agents tend to push for higher prices in order to get higher commissions. Let me address that for a second. I can't speak for all agents, but I know for myself, when I'm getting a commission for whatever amount, whether it's 2%, 3%, 4%, and yes, I've gotten 4% commissions before, that commission doesn't all go to me. It goes to my company, and then a split of that then goes to me. I'm not really thinking about, oh wow, if I could just get this client to pay $5,000 more, then I could get another $150 before my company split. That's genuinely not on my radar because I always run my business that I'll make more money and I'll make the most amount of money by simply making my clients happy. I'm not fretting $150. And to be honest, I've never spoken to an agent, including the bad ones, where I got the impression that they were trying to get a client up on price just to get a higher commission. Listen, we're just trying to get people under contract and get those contracts to closing. We're not trying to get someone up $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 just so that we can make a very, very small cut of that amount. That's not how this works for a huge portion of the business. Maybe there are some that do that, but like I said, I don't know. I personally have not communicated with any agents ever at any point in my life where I got the impression that they were trying to do that. And for listings, realtors typically want to list a home as cheaply as possible in order to get under contract quickly, which perhaps is his own ethical dilemma. But needless to say, realtors aren't trying to list homes for way more than they're worth because they're not going to sell. And so generally speaking, I don't think that specific concern is a major concern. But at the end of the day, realtors already don't have a great public image. And the more we talk about our commissions and our compensation, the worse our image will be. And unfortunately, we're going to have to talk about it a lot more than ever. So to put a bow on this, all in all, a lot is changing, but I don't think the headlines that came out of this, that suddenly sellers will be saving a ton of money on commissions without there being potential negative repercussions, is accurate. Just like when a house flipper uses cheap materials to save money, they always end up selling a home for less than they could have if they had spent more money. Similarly, I think it will be with sellers who take that scarcity mindset and say we try to save money on commissions. You get what you pay for, and buyers and sellers in real estate are about to learn that that's true with real estate agents, just like it is with everything else. That's all I have to say for this. I'm sure I'll get some questions, so my contact information is in the show notes if you guys have any questions. If you enjoyed this show, please subscribe, rate, review, all those good things, and we will talk again next time.